Welcome, everyone. My name is Mary Cavallero. I'm the Chief Broadcast Officer for SAG-AFTRA. Essentially work with primarily the news and broadcast members of SAG-AFTRA. And I want to welcome you tonight to an evening of discussion of trauma and self-care. We decided as a union it was important during this time, given all that our members are going through when they're doing their job, to be able to provide this resource to you. We hope that you find it informative and beneficial, and also a supportive way of providing you with education and just an understanding of what you and your colleagues are going through. I'm going to hand the evening over to one of our members, Frank Motek, who is a member of the Broadcast Steering Committee for SAG-AFTRA and also a well-known broadcaster in Los Angeles at KNX News Radio. So Frank, take it away.
Mary, thank you very, very much for this privilege. It's an honor to be part of this important discussion here tonight during the ongoing pandemic and the pandemic recession, when we're all facing tremendous uncertainty, anxiety, and pressure these days. It's a real privilege now to formally introduce our guest speaker here tonight, and also want to make a special note to thank the SAG-AFTRA News and Broadcast Department for funding this event, along with the SAG-AFTRA Foundation in partnership with the Columbia University School of Journalism's DART program. Right off the bat, I want to note that I think the biggest concern for journalists in all this is the cumulative trauma of the never-ending news cycles. As one of my colleagues here at the radio station, David Singer, who happens to be a licensed marriage and family therapist in Los Angeles and longtime news producer here, notes, we've been talking about this, journalists here in California, especially dealing with COVID, the stress of the election news cycle, wildfires, and just the normal daily stories we're covering. And more than really any time we can all remember, the news cycle is unrelenting, and the cumulative effect is certainly wearing down of our normal defenses and coping mechanisms, something that I'm sure we'll talk about here. And in addition, COVID is not a story that we can all leave behind when we clock out. Anxieties, private lives challenged, heightened, and our constant exposure to negative news about the virus. And I was talking to David just before we started here, and he happens to be a therapist, and he's strongly advising his clients to limit their news intake in all of this. And unfortunately, that's not an option for those who actually are doing the news and covering the news. So with that, let me formally introduce Bruce Shapiro, and I have to say I'm elated to meet you here, Bruce. I've been following the work of the DART Center and your work for many, many years, having taught the news radio course at USC, and I made it a point to reference your work and over a period of many, many years. So thank you so much for this privilege. Bruce Shapiro is Executive Director of the DART Center for Journalism and Trauma, a project of Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism, encouraging innovative reporting on violence, conflict, and tragedy worldwide. An award-winning reporter on human rights, criminal justice, and politics, Mr. Shapiro is a contributing editor at The Nation and U.S. correspondent from Late Night Live on the Australian Broadcasting Corporation's Radio National. He's also an adjunct professor and senior advisor for academic affairs at Columbia, where he teaches journalism ethics. Bruce Shapiro, thank you very much for joining us, and on behalf of all of us at SAG-AFTRA, thank you very much, and please welcome and please begin your presentation.
Thank you, Frank, and thank you all for being here. It's really a pleasure and an honor. I became a journalist in the first place, in part out of trade unionist family background, and working with SAG-AFTRA right now at this moment seems especially fitting and important. Look, as Frank said, and as you all know, this is an exceptional period of unrelenting stress from COVID, and also period of unrelenting trauma in the news cycle, in which some of the issues, the most fundamental inequities of our society that affect some of us in a very personal way, are surfacing even amid this particular crisis. And for those members who are out west, you've also got fires on top of that. For those of you who are in the south, you've got hurricane season on top of that. It's an extraordinary time to be doing this work, and it makes you reflect on the value of solidarity and what a union does, which I actually may circle back to. But I'm going to talk a little bit, first of all, from my own perspective. I am a journalist. I'm not a psychotherapist. I may occasionally play one on TV, but I'm not. I'm privileged, however, at the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma to work with some of the leading trauma clinicians and other kinds of mental health professionals who've devoted big parts of their own work to supporting journalists and trying to learn from those folks what we need to know about how our work affects us, and also what needs to be in our toolkit for reporting on vulnerable populations. I'm going to focus my initial talk, at least, mainly on the impact of this time on us and what we understand about some principles of self-care and collegial support. But if we want to go down the road of reporting questions, craft questions, our responsibilities at this time to individual sources or to communities, we can talk about that too. There are lots of rich craft directions this work suggests. Before I leap into my thing, though, I actually am hoping that a few of you can educate me. The Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma is the only academic center in the world really devoted to the intersection of reporting and violence, crisis, and tragedy. And so I'm always trying to learn from colleagues. And in particular at this time, none of us went into this whole period now knowing what to do, knowing how to work amid a pandemic, knowing how to be productive, knowing how to manage all of the different stresses. I'm wondering if a few of you would be willing to share with me and with your colleagues here one thing that's worked for you, that's made a difference in your ability to handle the last 6 months with some semblance of resilience and effectiveness. You're also entitled to say it's all been a shit show and nothing is working. I think we all feel like that sometimes. But seriously, partly I need to be educated because I'm constantly passing on to other news professionals stuff that's worked. And in part, I think your colleagues here will benefit. Bob Butler, your hand went up. And yeah, we'll use the Zoom hand-raising thing. And then you should unmute yourself and speak. So
yeah, thank you. Thank you for doing this. I'm actually heading out to work, but I wanted to take a few minutes to say, hey, the last 6 months, and actually what I found to be the most helpful for me and my colleagues is talking to each other. Mm-hmm. When you're out covering a protest, when you're out covering a fire, looking at people whose homes have been destroyed, that really sits with you. And I found that to have a conversation with one of my colleagues, or what I've done is actually call them when they're driving back to the station saying, how you doing? Yeah. And, oh, yeah, I'm doing, no. How are you doing? And they stop and reflect and they realize that it doesn't have an impact. Because I've had many cases where I myself have been personally impacted by a story that's brought me to tears because of all of the destruction that I've seen. So I find that to be very helpful.
Well, what's interesting about that is that in the research that's been done on journalists and on other trauma-facing professions like first responders and soldiers, it turns out that the single factor most associated with folks coping well is peer support, is social connection and collegial support. And I'm going to be talking more about this later. And I think it's valuable both at a kind of a neuroscience level, which I'll talk a bit about, and also at a kind of professional ethics and craft level, because we're in unprecedented times, unprecedented situations. And having that sense of support that is both, how are you doing emotionally, but also, how you doing? How's the story going? What kind of choices are we making? And having safe colleagues we can reflect on that with is, I think, really critical. So thank you for that. Anyone else got something that's worked for you in managing these last 6 months? iPad, whoever iPad is with no name. Your hand just went up.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
You got me. Okay, it's Erin Hassanzadeh. I'm a reporter at WCCO in Minneapolis, and I'm using my boyfriend's iPad, so forgive me. But
Okay,
I was
my
gonna
boyfriend's
say-
iPad, go for it.
I was gonna say that honestly, going to therapy is helpful too, and I think having those sessions provided by your employer, so you're like, okay, I've got my 8 sessions to use or lose this year. I think taking advantage of that benefit, and I think even maybe employers beefing that up right now is super helpful. I'm not someone who goes the rest of the year, but I have been going, and it's not the only solution, but I think having that from your employer is something that's, free and available to use is meaningful as well.
Certainly, I mean, not everyone is a therapy person, but for those for whom it works, as has worked, this is really valuable. And for others too. At the beginning of the pandemic, one of my wise psychologist colleagues at the Dart Center was on a call like this, and I heard her saying, listen, you need to think about whatever has worked for you and supported you at other tough times in the past and proactively seize that now. Grab it. And if one of them is therapy, go for it. If therapy has ever helped you, chances are you're going to benefit from it now. And, I'll talk more about this later, but in the zone of overwhelming stress and overwhelming trauma exposure, these are actually issues that there's a substantial body of good science and strong therapeutic technique behind. And there's even a growing number of clinicians who have as their special focus the work of news professionals and have begun to try to understand the challenges that we face, which may be different from other professions. How about one more before I go into my thing? Any other little blue hands here? Something that's worked for you. And it can be big or small, work, studio life, home life, family, whatever. One more thing. You can't all be hopelessly mired in misery. Steve Simpson.
Yeah, thank you very much. Also calling from Minneapolis from WCCO Radio.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, Frank, actually you mentioned this, but there is some truth to it, and that idea of steering clear of social media when possible, and those other things. I got into this business because news was kind of a hobby to me first, right? I mean, I got into it because I like being around it, but I have to be much more careful about how often I expose myself to it when I don't need to. Now, again, for those of us in this business, it's a lot harder to do that than someone who has a different type of job. But there are times, like on weekends, when I'm like, you know what, I don't have to doom scroll through Twitter right now. I don't have to do that. I can go take a walk, or I can go, do something else. And so that's something that I think has helped me a little bit too.
Yeah, and actually there are sound neurological reasons why going on a news diet to the extent that we can, lowering our arousal, putting up some boundaries can be really helpful in keeping our brain effective for the times that we need to be engaged with the news. On pretty much every one of these conversations that I've been having lately, folks end up talking about getting locked into sort of an addictive cycle of doom scrolling, which in our work is really easy to do. And that can turn into a force that propels you down a kind of bad rabbit hole. So I think there's a lot to be said for that. All right, I'm now gonna like do the thing I'm worst at, which is sharing my screen. So bear with me while I do that. And I'm going to run through a little bit of a PowerPoint, and forgive me for this, but it seems to be the best way of doing it. What I really want to do is lay down a little bit of language and a few ideas that situate the particular stresses and pressures of this time and terrors of this time and threats in our journalism specific context. Talk a little bit about what we know about our profession, a little bit about what works, and then we'll have plenty of room for conversation by the time I'm done with it. So bear with me while I run through this. So going the distance, trauma, resilience, and journalism in a time of crisis. Going the distance because, I think all of us, I certainly in my own life as a journalist, journalism teacher, whatever, had the experience this spring of having everything that I had planned for my life blow up. And not only that, but having a lot of how I knew to do my job blow up. And we all had to get out the Scotch tape and bubble gum, reinvent how we as individuals work, reinvent how our news organizations do their job. And one of the things that I'm blown away by as I've been speaking with news organizations for the last couple of months is the incredible spirit of innovation and courage that folks brought to this. And, you know, that's great. But we now know that the way we're doing news is the way we're going to be doing it for the next year or two. And that means, and we also know that this news cycle that is in a particularly intense frenzy is likely to be in an intense frenzy for some months, if not longer than that. And what that means is that we need some strategies for going from crisis to resilience, going from crisis to sustainability in our own work and in our news organization's work. I'm going to frame my thoughts in that way. If I can get back to my own slide here. Yes, there we go. So obviously, yes, COVID-19 is here for the duration. We are intersecting with police violence, with Black Lives Matter, with fires, with events and issues, and the election, of course, that are so profoundly stirring. Interestingly, in just about all of these crises, our work, your work, the work of news, is more consequential than it's ever been. I mean, like, journalism is the pathway out of these crises to a certain extent. And that puts a big burden on all of your shoulders. Makes the work important, but it's also a big burden. And the combination of these issues and stresses challenges us. It challenges our craft, our skills, but also challenges our personal capacities. And we need to face that so that we can do the job we signed up for and that the world so badly needs us to do right now. One way I want to situate this is with an understanding of how we as journalists relate to stress. And this is an important conversation. All of you in this Zoominar, by virtue of your choice of profession, however diverse you are in how some people are anxious, some are calm, some are courageous, some are simpering cowards, except when facing bad guys at press conferences, right? There's all kinds of folks here who handle many stresses in different ways. But all of us on some level as news professionals are stress monkeys. All of us get into this because we like, or at least need, deadlines. We like a news agenda that changes every day, stories, sources that are constantly evolving. We like speaking truth to power. We also like or work in amidst technology that's changing all the time. We know that professionally, a high degree of stress is good for us, makes us perform better. You are all people who know how to ride the stress curve like a surfer on a good wave, or like an athlete in a marathon who can just really get to that place and go for a while. But even surfers, if the wave goes on for too long, will crash and, fall into the water. Even athletes, their muscles fatigue. And our brains are like that too. This chart shows neurological arousal, read stress. As neurological arousal or stress goes up, performance goes up to a point. And then you all know that if stress goes on a little bit too long, you start to become less effective, you become fatigued, you become tired. If stress goes on way too long, really performance can collapse. And at the far end of that curve, you can get actual burnout, which is a clinical condition. The characteristic, I'm going through all this basic neuroscience, because the characteristic of this moment, of the COVID-19 moment, is of open-ended and unremitting stress. That's the nature of the pandemic. And the clinicians who I work with, the psychologists and psychiatrists who work a lot with journalists and know how we work and know our lives, many of them believe that the signature challenge we face in this period is of exhaustion and burnout from protracted and unremitting stress. We have the stresses simply as human beings and citizens of the pandemic, of worrying about our families, our health. Some of us have already had losses in this pandemic, others will. We are worried about our kids. There's all this, we have to deal with school, there's all of this. We have our profession specific challenges, reinventing the news, finding new ways to report, tracking science amid a science denying administration. All of this is going on. And this means open-ended, unremitting stress. The World Health Organization defines burnout as chronic workplace stress, as resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. It's a clinical condition that's about radically reduced professional efficacy, and it can destroy careers and deeply damage lives. This may be the signature challenge or even the signature injury of journalists in this period. But this is also combined with another simple fact about our job. We are exposed professionally to a huge amount of trauma, to the aftermath, the experience of and aftermath of violence, tragedy, crisis. Now, it's pretty obvious to say this. You know, you're all in SAG-AFTRA, you've all probably covered bridge collapses, car wrecks, fires. You're now, many of you, covering COVID-19. You may have covered courts, all of this sort of stuff. But it's worth unpacking all the different levels on which we absorb trauma in our professional lives, and particularly in this current news cycle, given everything that's going on. There's direct exposure. Those of you who have reported on the streets of protests or had cops shoot at you or are working in hospitals or working with fires are dealing with a high degree of direct exposure to fear-inducing, terror-inducing, distress-inducing experiences. And that's what we do. But it's not just the physical front line. We also, as news professionals, over the course of our careers, absorb a tremendous amount of what clinicians would call vicarious and secondary trauma. That empathetic engagement with vulnerable sources where we are dealing with their grief and distress and loss and trauma. That steady diet of graphic imagery that people on video editing desks have always had to deal with, and photographers always had to deal with, but now so many other hands are touching social media, are touching police shooting videos, all this sort of thing. Many of you are probably dealing, as our profession as a whole is in this country right now, with higher levels of threat, abuse, and harassment. And we are right now covering a series of events that breach the social contract, that may threaten our own sense of safety, whether it's about the behavior of police at people who look like us or are us, whether it's a pandemic that has taken the lives of our neighbors and family members and colleagues. These are things that are not right, and that may further undermine our individual sense of safety. We do this over the course of a career, of course. The last 6 months, as intense as they are only the cherry on the ice cream soda. And these stories interact, these events interact with what we bring to the equation in the first place. Our personal history, which may include individual or family or community exposure to trauma. Our identities, which may involve community experiences of threat and violence. All of these things are part of the journalist equation. And we now know, actually, from more than a decade of research into news professionals, that that journalists are exposed to far higher levels of trauma through all of these different pipelines than the general public. And even because of all the various vicarious and secondary pathways, sometimes more trauma even than some other trauma-facing professionals like cops and firefighters. We deal with a lot and are dealing with a lot now. That's an important reality check. The second reality check, though, is that it's very important not to pathologize ourselves. The research also shows that despite this much higher level than normal level of exposure, our rates of PTSD and other psychological injury are actually modest, relatively low. Most of the time, we cover difficult stories and may feel shaken up for a short time, but recover our equilibrium. We do well. Having a job to do in the face of mayhem, it turns out, is a protective factor. Being able to make meaning out of horrific events is a protective factor. The craft, having an ethical practice, an ethical code, is protective in the psychological literature, it turns out, and especially having colleagues. These are all protective factors. The challenge is that the specific mechanisms that are involved with trauma, when they do get under our skin, which is a minority of the time, can affect the mechanisms we rely on most in our work as news professionals. And I'll circle back to that. That's, for those of you who don't know her, that's my friend Maria Ressa, the founding editor and publisher of Rappler in the Philippines, who just greets death threats and criminal charges and all sorts of stuff with exactly the kind of equanimity and leadership you see there. But she's actually, it turns out, characteristic of our profession. We do okay. We don't want to pathologize ourselves. It's also important to say right now, given the particular challenges in the news cycle, that when it comes to facing trauma, and when it comes to facing overwhelming stress, identity is never neutral. I already said this, we bring who we are to the equation. And that's a source both of insight and vulnerability. In the last few months, journalists of color have, on the one hand, brought tremendous energy and focus to the reporting on police violence, which has really changed the national conversation, and at the same time have expressed frustration at lack of support from their news organizations, or struggle to find therapeutic resources or other things. Identity is just a conversation we need to include and not pretend that these different experiences don't exist. The trauma science tells us that accumulated experience of trauma, whether individual or community, affects how we're going to interact with these events. So I think we need to lean into it rather than pretend identity doesn't exist as journalists. Okay. The reason the trauma conversation is so important to us, and here I'm going to ask you to ride with me for just a few minutes while I do a very sketchy bit of science, okay, is that trauma exists on 3 levels, all of which go to the heart of our ability to work as journalists. A biological level, a psychological level, a social level. Trauma, my shrink friends tell me, is a biopsychosocial experience with biopsychosocial consequences. What does that mean? Well, first of all, at the most basic biological level, any of you who've been in a minor screech crunch car accident or had to run from the cops in a kind of not too consequential way, let alone having, if any of you, and you have, I know many of you, faced major threats in your life, know that when we're facing threat, our smart journalist brains go offline and the body starts to react in ways that keep us alive. Involuntarily, heart beats faster to get blood to muscles, oxygen to the places it needs to go to. If we're experiencing a blow or pain, the brain releases natural opiates that help us not feel pain, slow things down, help us assess the situation and take in information in a different way. We may become hyper alert to the information that's necessary to survive. We do what's needed, and there's that feeling of being amped up like this. The brain is wide open, the body is poised, and that helps people survive. That's a biological set of responses. But sometimes when if terror is great enough, fear is great enough or a threat is chronic enough, people's brains and bodies don't always recalibrate. They begin to react in situations of relative safety as if they are still in danger. The brain may, for example, begin to process memory a little bit differently. Trauma memories are stored in a different mechanism, in a different part of the brain. They come when they come more easily. They're designed to be more easily accessible so that we can remember what danger looks like. But that's not a great thing if you're trying to file today's story about garlic and last year's police shooting video keeps repeating on you when you don't want it to, right? Intrusive memory in the form of nightmares, in the form of images that come involuntarily, in the form of full-blown flashbacks, but also in the form of subtle bodily sense memories. Intrusive memory is a hallmark of trauma if it goes on in involuntary ways, in ways that interfere with life. People may also stay sometimes aroused, anxious. Hyper-arousal is the clinical word, where they have a harder time concentrating, harder time getting to sleep, may become quicker to anger, harder time getting on to people. And again, we rely on our capacity as journalists to concentrate, to get on with colleagues, to put together complex stories. If our mechanisms if we're more anxious than we normally should be, that can begin to interfere with work. This is a psychological change. Or sometimes people go the other way. They become numb, avoidant of any experiences, any reminders of traumatic experience, any conflicts that may evoke threat responses that can be so overwhelming. So people become shut down, that 1,000-yard stare, or lose the ability to empathize. If these go on for a long time, these are long-term psychological changes, changes in how we apprehend the world, process the world, deal with it. And that can be very damaging for us as journalists. And then finally, at the social level, we are trusting creatures. Our ability to get through life depends to a surprising extent on our ability to trust other human beings. If I want to cross the street to the little Italian greengrocer to get my arugula here in New Haven, Connecticut, I have to believe that all of the cars here are going to actually stop at the stoplight and not run me over. This is totally irrational, right? But we do believe it. The trauma survivor at one level is the person for whom that faith has been ripped up. Trauma survivors may lose the capacity to trust. These are true of trauma survivors generally, but the mechanisms are what we rely on most. Accuracy of memory, controllability of memory, ability to concentrate, to get along, to focus, to pull complex material together in a meaningful way. The ability to make empathetic connection with readers, viewers, listeners, with colleagues, with sources. When that's undermined, our work really can go down the crapper fast. So all of these things and that trust equation that's so central to journalism, this is why you don't need years of therapy to assess whether trauma is beginning to get to you as a journalist. Trauma begins to show itself in really pretty obvious ways that are linked to work performance. Because these mechanisms are so central to our work, people who've been good at deadline who begin to blow it, as opposed to people like me who've always been shitty, right? But people, people who change in their ability to meet deadline, people who are angrier than they used to be, or seem withdrawn, completely numb, losing the ability to concentrate. These are all signs, if you've been doing a lot of work in the trauma space, that things are getting to us a little bit. And at the more extreme, these become a kind of neurological spin cycle that can lead journalists to chronic risk-taking so they can feel anything, or really bad spin cycles around deadline or other workplace stuff, into chronic dissociation where people just kind of lose the ability to be there in the moment, difficult relationships with colleagues, all of these really very destructive things. So we do want to pay attention. And it's important, especially for SAG-AFTRA members, to understand something. As far as the brain is concerned, there is actually not a lot of difference between the physical front line on the pavement and the digital front line. There's now a substantial body of science saying that relentless and unbounded professional exposure to graphic imagery is a pathway to PTSD and other psychological injury, or can be. A steady diet of graphic imagery that you have to look at in your job is coded by the brain as threat and danger. It goes into those memory mechanisms and into those associative pathways. And it's actually secondary or vicarious trauma is now listed as a cause in the current most recent update of the PTSD definition in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Very important to understand that right now. Also, that online abuse and threat or other kinds of harassment, abuse, and threat act as an accelerant on all this. And women in journalism, identity, again, is never neutral. We actually don't have a lot of good research on race, but we do have a couple of years of emerging research on women in journalism, and we're finding that both the prevalence of intimidation, threat, and harassment is both from sources in the public and from within the profession, is higher than even those of us who've been looking at this for a long time expected, and the impact is real. Okay, so there's this kind of big ugly world out there of COVID-19 stress and lots of trauma in the news cycle, the fires, the cops, the president, the whole thing. The question is, what do we do about it? And this is, I said I would leave the science and get practical. I'm going to do that now. I'm going back, though, to that stress curve. We've been talking so much in this country, thanks Dr. Fauci, no thanks Donald Trump, about flattening the curve of coronavirus, right? And why do we talk about that? What does that mean? Well, flattening the curve means preventing those peaks and crashes, keeping the medical system from being overwhelmed by the number of COVID-19 cases. The same thing applies to the brain's ability to metabolize stress. You don't want that bell-shaped curve. You don't want arousal to go on for so long that the brain becomes completely exhausted, fatigued, falls off in performance, and burns out. You just don't want to get to that far into the curve. You don't want those peaks and valleys. You want to actually break the arousal cycle before you get to that crash point while your performance is still high. Sounds very abstract, but there's a kind of core principle that I think we can apply as news professionals to resilience right now. The ability, resilience is, not to not being affected, but the ability to recover. And that's neurological recovery time. What I've learned from the brain scientists who the DART Center works with is that brains, like other parts of the body, need rest. They need to metabolize stress, need to metabolize traumatic imagery and fearful experience. A resilient journalist, says every study that's ever been done, is a well-rested one. That sounds easy to say. We're in a deadline business. I'm in an unrelenting news cycle, right? Well, by rest, I don't just mean the 3 weeks that you're actually going to get to take off after the election and the inauguration and who knows what else. Rest, neurological recovery time, is about building structures into our workday that allow for brain rest even amid our normal, very demanding routines. Things like nano breaks, things like changes of task, in that walk around the block. All those sorts of things are about deliberately seizing opportunities for internal recovery. Time off is important, and I may talk more about that, but how we manage neurological recovery time in our normal workday turns out to be really critical. And I'm now going to get very practical and journalistic about this. What does this look like? Well, the first thing, and this came up already at the beginning of the conversation, is to be looking at our relationship to technology. Right now, I'm talking to you because of technology. Technology is great, but our phones, this thing, is a stress addiction machine. Every time you look at a tweet, every time you look at Facebook, even if it's stuff you like your niece's Facebook page, that's a shot of arousal, right? Let alone when you get locked into the sort of addictive doom scrolling thing that so many of us are. And of course, we're spending all this time on Zoom now. That means that to give ourselves the gift of neurological recovery time and to stay effective, we do need to assert some boundaries around the technology. We do need to go on a little bit of a techno diet. That's not in ways that undermine our work, of course, but there are things. For example, at bedtime now, I only read ink and paper books, and preferably novels at bedtime. I find that dealing with my devices at all at bedtime, the pixels are a little bit arousing in and of themselves. It's too easy to get distracted and then go to check the email and then go to check Twitter. So I put the phone away for a half hour or so before sleep, or a full hour if I can. At lunch, I put the phone across the kitchen table from me, not in front of me. I don't look at it, right? I look for other opportunities during the day for no device time. There are also no news diets, or that you can apply the same thing. The crucial thing is to recognize just how much low-level stress our devices are bringing into our lives, and therefore we need to own them, not be owned by them. We need to set boundaries. We want to shorten that stress response. Give a little recovery time by shortening the stress response, setting technological boundaries. I also think that in this particular period, given the open-ended stress represented by COVID-19, given the violence and continuing crisis in our news cycles now, every single person working in journalism, every single SAG-AFTRA member ought to have a simple journalist self-care plan. An individual one that works for you, but that addresses certain fundamental sort of neurological needs and psychological needs that can help protect us. The first, and there are few elements that are common to good, attainable, limited self-care plans. This is not the time for those big New Year's resolutions about the vast number of pounds you're going to lose, or the vast number of more miles you're going to run, or like, this is not about that. This is about finding small attainable adjustments to make that give you some control over your own well-being. Starting with knowing your own signs, thinking back on what it feels like when you're working well, when you're really in flow, what it feels like when you're overwhelmed and exhausted and stressed, and knowing how those manifest for yourself. Knowing, as one of your colleagues said at the beginning, what has worked for you in the past. Therapy has worked for you in the past, do therapy. Yoga has worked for you in the past, go back to yoga. You're a piano player and you get really centered when you're playing piano, add the piano back to your life, thank you. Right, whatever has worked for you in the past, you want to think about that and identify it now. So that's know your own signs, number one. Number two, it's very important to stay physically grounded and lower your biological arousal. It turns out that when we lower our biological arousal, we're lowering neurological arousal and interrupting the over-consolidation of traumatic imagery, interrupting the over-consolidation of stress responses. So things, aerobic exercise, running, swimming, cycling, yoga, meditation, mindfulness. There's a very robust evidence base for the value of any of those kinds of practices in lowering arousal and helping us metabolize difficult experience. Particularly also things around breathing, which slows down that overheated brain response. Social connection and collegial support. I mentioned at the very beginning that in all the studies that have been done of journalists now for a generation, and of studies of other frontline professionals, the single factor most associated with resilience, with coping well with unusual stresses and threats and trauma, is peer support and social connection. And the single factor most associated with PTSD risk and other kinds of psychological injury is social isolation. What that says to me is that we need to assert a culture of peer support with our colleagues, our media colleagues right now. We also need to take some responsibility, excuse me, in our own self-care plans for making the social and peer connections that we need to maintain our nourishment at a time when we are all being isolated by the nature of social distancing. You know, it's not one size fits all. Some of us are more gregarious, some of us are more loners. But if you are on the loner side of the equation, I would say to you that all the science says that I don't want you to have a head transplant, but you might want to add a little bit more of a self-care plan that involves some structured, deliberate social engagement, because your brain does need it. Even if, like a lot of people I know, you're someone who's actually been able to lean into the pandemic's work environment pretty well. We need social connection. If you are doing work that involves a heavy crisis and trauma load, whether it's covering fires, covering police stuff, covering local crime, any of that, you do want to be pacing your trauma load. And that means on the one hand, during the workday, finding ways of making sure you're not spending hours just absorbing imagery and absorbing distressing stuff, but shifting attention, pacing it, taking that walk around the block, whatever. In the long run, it also may mean doing other kinds of assignments from time to time, using other muscles so that your brain has a chance to kind of rejigger. Sleep. This is a hard thing to say to a webinar full of journalists, but all the science, again, says that sleep is highly associated with psychological resilience, and protracted chronic sleep loss increases the risk of PTSD, depression, and burnout by a quite dramatic factor. So, well, all of this means, what does all this add up to? What it really means is that a self-care plan, self-care principles, are not something we do because we deserve it, because we should be nice to ourselves, or because we feel bad. I mean, those are all good reasons. But they really belong in our basic professional toolkit. They are just as important to our performance, to our careers, to our survival, and to the communities we're covering, to the stories, as verifying facts, as knowing how to edit video, as any of the many crafts that you folks practice. If we don't follow self-care and peer support principles, we end up betraying our own capacity to work. We end up failing in stories. We end up failing our colleagues and undermining the reason we're here. So this is basic stuff, okay? There are some great self-care apps out there for those of you who are so inclined. I like this one, COVID Coach. It's from the National Center for PTSD, which is part of the VA. It's sort of like the Centers for Disease Control for Trauma, except it hasn't yet been discovered by Donald Trump, so they're still doing good work. End of editorial, I promise. But this particular app has lots of good access to resources, mood management strategies, stuff like that. There's also great self-care apps and great mindfulness apps and things out there that some of you are using. And if actually anyone wants to throw whatever you're using into the chat for your colleagues, I'm sure folks would appreciate it. For the last few months, I've been collecting a lot of journalist-to-journalist self-care strategies, trying to identify what has worked for people over the course of this pandemic and over the course of this very traumatic news cycle. Which is why I solicited those ideas at the beginning. They have fallen into a few buckets, which happen to map very well with the trauma science. Ritualized breaks. A lot of people are talking about the importance of regularizing breaks during the day. That may be splashing cold water on your face between Zooms. It may be the walk around the block during your morning coffee break every day. There are lots of different ways, but ritualized breaks are important. A lot of folks have talked about the value of a work journal, of kind of closing out the day just by jotting down what you did, what you're worried about for tomorrow, anything that brings some kind of closure to the day. That's an intellectual bookend that gets all those worries and stresses out of your head and onto paper, gives you that much more control. And control is what we're really we're looking to gain little bits of control at a time when the universe is careening out like this. Marking the beginning and end of the day. A lot of folks have been talking to me about strategies that have worked like that. I've now adopted this like insanely fetishized pour over coffee thing that I do for me and my wife before I get to the desk in the morning. And it's become kind of a thing that gives me just that little bit of control at the beginning of the day, and I have some end of the day routines too. No device time I talked about. Comfort files are something a lot of people are using very productively, and that a lot of my psychologist friends use. Comfort files are just those that handful of calming images to you. They may be generic, or they may be things in your experience from your files and your photos that you keep on your phone, that you keep on your computer, that you keep in your head, but that you deliberately call up when you begin to feel, knowing your own signs, when you begin to feel a little bit, oh, I'm a little overstressed, or, oh, that Floyd video is repeating on me when I don't want to. When you call up a comforting image, cognitive psychology tells us that we are actively preventing the over-consolidation of traumatic imagery. We're breaking stress response and fear response cycles in the brain. So it's a really important set of techniques. Clinicians who work with torture survivors, with sexual assault survivors, with veterans, use these kind of techniques on themselves to keep from being overwhelmed by their clients' stories. We can learn from therapists in this and use those kinds of imaging techniques to lower our body's stress responses and break that cycle of overconsolidation of stress and overconsolidation of trauma. Sharing stuff that works is really important. First of all, because we don't know what the fuck works, and it's only by sharing that we'll learn it, but also because it's a way of making professional and social connection and validating it. So if in medicine, a doctor friend of mine told me that there's a saying, learn one, do one, teach one. This is the same thing. If you've got lessons learned, do it. If you deal with a lot of graphic content, which many of you working at TV stations in particular or on social media desks will, you need a graphic content strategy so that it's not just overwhelming you. There's a great tip sheet on this on the Dart Center website. I'm mindful of the clock and I don't want to take too much time on it now, but we can share the tip sheet later if you want. Ethics and standards, it turns out, are really important to our own mental health at this period. There's been some very interesting research into the last few years suggesting that when journalists cover events that violate the social contract, like school shootings, when we commit ethical breaches in the course of that, it acts as an accelerant on PTSD and other kinds of psychological distress and psychological injury in the aftermath. Journalists who commit ethical breaches in the course of covering trauma themselves do worse psychologically. So when we're doing our best work in the face of COVID-19 or in the face of police violence or in the face of those fires, we're not just preserving the credibility of the story, the credibility of the station, our own careers. We're protecting our own mental health. We're avoiding what psychologists now call moral injury, which is when frontline professions feel themselves implicated in the very violations they set out to address, right? Moral injury, we want to avoid that. And so our ethics and standards right now are important. This was a slide originally for freelancers, but it applies to all of you here. It turns out that mentorship is really important right now. When you take care of yourself, you're all of you, I think, are probably leaders in your newsroom at some level. You may have a formal senior title. You may be a shop steward. You may be someone who others just go to as a role model or for advice. It turns out that leadership in times of trauma and overwhelming stress matters a lot. People need you to be a resilient role model. They will take their cue from your own self-care. If people see you having a little bit of a self-care plan and managing your technology and boundaries, that will validate it, especially for younger colleagues who may fear getting what they need, right? Building a culture of reflection and learning. I think this is an important role that the union could play right now. Looking back over the last 6 months, say, and saying, what have we done right as a union and what have we done right as a professional community of broadcasters? What has been challenging and directly confront what we've screwed up? And most important, what are the lessons learned going forward? Trauma robs us of future. It keeps us stuck in the present tense. So when we say, what do we do right? What are we challenged by? And what are the lessons learned that I will pass on to my colleagues? We're actually restoring a sense of future. And again, I think that right now we kind of need to be thinking strategically about going to sustainability. And that means doing that kind of analysis of the last 6 months. Also, the mission. There's a lot of good research suggesting that journalists and other frontline professionals cope better when they know why they're doing their job. And I don't just mean in the big civics lesson way about journalism. I mean, why is this story important? Why should we talk to these sources? If we can articulate that for ourselves or our colleagues, that's really helping build resilience. And finally, again, being a good colleague. And this is where the role of a union may be singularly relevant right now. Sharing basic information on trauma, sharing access to resources that you all have either within your companies or within the union, being an educated ear for colleagues, and seeking out help when we need it. A number of news organizations actually around the world have in the last several years developed formal, organized trauma peer support mechanisms. Where journalists in every office and bureau, a few get trained up to be the sort of super colleagues on trauma. Australian Broadcasting, the BBC, NPR, Reuters all have peer support systems. And that's one way to go. And if any of your employers are interested in that kind of thing, that's something I can always talk to them about. But informal peer support is just as central as any formal trained thing. I'm going to stop there. As I said, I've deliberately not addressed kind of reporting on trauma questions, but we can go there in the conversation if you want. And, wherever. I kept it focused on the self-care and collegial support because that's the moment we're in. But I want to spend the rest of the time, a solid half hour, talking with you. I think we're using the little blue hand thing. So if any of you want to raise it, have a question or something that resonated with you or that you hated that I said, that rankled.
Bruce, let me start by asking you, how are you doing?
Well, I'm spending a lot of time on Zoom. On the other hand, I'm not having to commute. I live about 75 miles from New York City, so I've gained a little bit of time. I've deliberately put certain boundaries and self-care practices into my own life. I've upped certain self-care things that either I hadn't paid attention to for a while or that we did in a casual way. So I'm lucky enough to live not too far from Long Island Sound. My wife and I go swimming every day, or at least we have up until now. It's October 15th. I don't know how long that's going to last. I'll be getting on my bike once it gets too cold for swimming. We eat at kind of the same time every day. I'm lucky enough to have a job where I have at least that much control. I'm taking greater care with boundaries around technology and at bedtime. But look, there's no Band-Aid for this. This is a difficult time. I'm lucky enough to have a job that seems relevant to this moment, and where I haven't had to change what I do too much except for not traveling, so my frequent flyer balance has gone to crap. But this is hard. I'm also lucky enough to have an adult child, not a small child at home, and I would be managing much less well if I had a small child at home. But thank you.
You've done an amazing job with this. How is it that you took this field on? How did it get started for you in identifying this area, which largely still is not getting as much attention as it deserves, I think?
Well, I mean, for me, I had a kind of a personal pathway to this. In the mid 90s, I was doing a lot of reporting on criminal justice, both first locally here in Connecticut, where I lived and started out as a reporter in the 80s, and then nationally, and things like the Biden crime bill of 1994. I covered that. And in the middle of doing all this reporting on criminal justice, death penalty, prisons, completely randomly, I was badly injured in an assault, in a mass stabbing, actually, which was covered very heavily, it being the kind of event that it was, and happening on a slow news night in August, involving people who were university professors and magazine writers and whatever. It got a fair amount of press attention. So I had the kind of strange experience of going from being the reporter covering crime to being a victim of crime, being covered. Had some really good experiences, some really terrible experiences. I ended up doing a little writing about that. And I was also, and became convinced that we needed some extra stuff in our toolkit for dealing with victims and with the impact of these difficult events. It turned out that there were a few other people at the same time around the US and in other countries beginning to ask the same questions. And we found one another, as people do. Some were psychiatrists and psychologists, some were other journalists or journalism educators, victim advocates. And in the late 90s, in 1999, a terrific foundation in Michigan, the DART Foundation, which is the family foundation of the people who invented the styrofoam coffee cup, agreed to start funding this, and they've been our core funder ever since. But it went from being a kind of a side interest as I was continuing work as an investigative and human rights reporter to becoming a big international job, because I think so much, for me, the recognition was that so much of what we cover, what counts as news, involves the worst things that happen to people. The first story I ever covered as a 19-year-old was of a young woman in the neighborhood I was living in Chicago who died in a gas leak. She was my own age, lived around the corner. No one said, here's how you interview victims. Here's what, there's a whole bunch of stuff that I just had to figure out. And if I think back to my own early career as a local reporter, I covered immensely distressing stuff. And there wasn't a language for that. There wasn't a toolkit for that. There wasn't a self-care side to that. You wouldn't send someone to cover, a football game who doesn't know what a goal is. And yet we routinely expect young reporters to cover tragedy without really a lot of thinking about it. That was the impulse that led to the creation of the DART Center. And then it turned out that when we're talking about covering victims and what we need to know about things like post-traumatic stress disorder in survivors of violence, if we're going to cover them, turns out no one had ever asked, what about us as journalists? So we sponsored the first ever research that was done on this. And I'm lucky enough to have some top level researchers engaged with us. And then that in turn led to work with news organizations and unions and others on self-care and peer support kinds of work, asking, within the craft and ethics of journalism, what can we do to take care of our profession better?
And speaking of the union, we greatly appreciate SAG-AFTRA News and Broadcast Department, along with the foundation, and of course everyone there at Columbia University School of Journalism's DART program for organizing this today. Tell us about the importance of, in your view, SAG-AFTRA, for example, in spreading this message, and just the fact that we're all be able to do this together, and the benefit of union membership when it comes to an issue like this.
Right. Well, so first of all, at the level that I just described earlier in my riff, all the literature says that collegial support, whatever channel it comes from, is the single most important factor in the psychological resilience of journalists when facing overwhelming stress and overwhelming trauma. It's the best preventative we have. It's better than therapy. It's better than drugs. It's the thing that shows up over and over and over. So simply as a vehicle for collegial connection and support at a time when social distancing is forcing us apart, unions are important. Secondly, trauma is made worse by economic dislocation. Mental distress, mental health distress is made worse by economic stress and economic dislocation. There's a tremendous amount of research on this. By fighting for the economic health of our profession, unions are fighting for mental health. I think that's important. And when unions take up destigmatizing mental health for trauma-facing journalists, I think that's tremendously important. And finally, my own understanding of trauma and of what we're all experiencing now in the COVID period is about a loss of agency, a loss of things we can control. Unions, which are all about power, are all about gaining some agency and control over things that formerly were the purview of owners and corporations and bosses and all that sort of thing. Unions, I think, play a particular role in restoring solidarity and restoring power at a time when we need a little bit more power. So, as journalists, you know, it's a tough economic climate. It would be a lot tougher, and therefore the mental stresses would be a lot tougher if there weren't unions. And having these channels of trusting communication and trusting advocacy, I think, are also really important.
I think we were half joking when you referenced these Zoom meetings. We'll probably have to take a look at the impact of these formats, right? These Zoom meetings. How do you think that's affecting people nowadays? It's certainly been somewhat wearing on people to have just this outlet. Thank God we have it, right? But it's getting wearing.
Well, it is, and you know, look, A, there's no Band-Aid, and B, there's a lot that we don't understand. We don't yet know the full psychological benefits or the full psychological costs of Zoom. I think it'll be a little while until we know what this means for us in our professional and emotional lives, what it means for our kids and their educational lives. I believe in evidence-based decision-making. I can tell you anecdotally, A, that I think that Zoom has been tremendously helpful in enabling people to see faces, to engage as colleagues in a different way than the phone. And we're all figuring out what works better on Zoom and what doesn't. I think Zoom is great for one-on-ones. It's a little bit less satisfying for a big meeting like this, and yet it's enabling us to have it at a time when we otherwise couldn't, and that's life-saving. There's also Zoom fatigue, and people are going through cycles. For a while, I was routinely recommending the Zoom cocktail hours and stuff, which I still think are important. But in the last month, I've seen interest in those things really wane. I think people are like, okay, yeah, I get it, and like, enough already. I think we're all going through cycles of flirting with new stuff on Zoom and also with other social media platforms. A lot of newsrooms now are using Slack channels and an app called Donut to arrange meetups and to keep people talking. My particular lens is the lens of social connection, collaboration, and collegial support. And for that, on balance, I think Zoom has been a real benefit. This pandemic would be a lot harder if we didn't have robust video conferencing available. But it's also part of technological burnout. And I started on Zoom at 7:30 this morning, and I did build a couple of hours break there in the day, but it does make for long days.
We want to open up the floor to questions. If anybody does have a question, I know the first question is sometime slow in coming. So if there's a second question out there, we'll take it and we'll watch for your hand. But in the meantime, it's a very, very difficult time. And since you've been covering this issue for so many, many years, obviously in the news business, we tend to look when doing stories at extreme examples. I remember doing a series on drunk driving years ago, and the news director suggested, well, you need to find someone that's been arrested, more than once. So I found someone who was arrested 18 times for habitual drunk driving. So maybe I can ask you this, maybe you can share with us, based on your experience, some extreme examples of journalists who've have had a very stressful experience, and maybe some extreme examples that you've studied over the years.
Well, I think there are extreme examples. Some of them have been written about, or folks have written themselves. There's the late, great Marie Colvin, British conflict correspondent, who wrote about her own experience of PTSD and ultimately was killed on an assignment that many of her colleagues felt she was really not well enough to have maintained her judgment on in the best way on, which is not to blame Marie at all. I'm someone I knew and admired. but there are those cases in war correspondence of people who become more engaged in risk than they should be, and most war correspondents are not that person. Most conflict correspondents are people who just for whatever reasons are good at those particular stresses and are very principled, dedicated news professionals. But there are times when folks put themselves or their colleagues in danger. There was a case in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina of a photojournalist who, a brilliant, experienced photographer at the Times pick, who ended up having a comprehensive breakdown and leading the police on a high-speed chase, and survived only because he was white and because the cops recognized him and as someone who'd been working with them as a photographer for years. There are people who've lost their careers. But I also don't like to focus too much on the extreme outcomes. I think it's actually very important to say that all that we know says that resilience is the norm, that self-care can help mitigate the impact of the difficult things that we cover, including the most routine kinds. The research says that often the most distress comes from the most routine stuff, the car accidents that are things we can identify with, covering communities that are like us or that we identify with. All those, it's the routine trauma exposures that often can be the most affecting. We can mitigate those impacts in all kinds of ways. And we also can get help sooner rather than later if we do find ourselves changing in ways that we don't like, because you don't want to get locked into that destructive spin cycle that takes you down the far end of a burnout or the far end of PTSD. I think, as with so much else, just as in crime, sometimes we cover the most spectacular crimes while neglecting the most common risks like domestic violence. So with journalism and trauma, we sometimes focus a little more than we should on the extreme cases of PTSD and burnout that are public, and ignore the steady drip, drip, drip of difficult experience on local correspondence covering sometimes big spectacular events of the Black Lives Matter protest level, but more often the routine of criminal courts, the routine of car wrecks, the routine of hurricanes and all this, or now the routine of COVID. It's the routine trauma and the routine exposure that demands the routine self-care, the routine collegial support, the routine getting help when you need it thing.
Appreciated what Bob Butler said earlier about asking his colleagues how they're doing. And Bob, of course, is a heart of gold. And when he asked that question, I know he asks out of concern and caring. And is there any format that you would recommend, maybe even that the union could implement on as far as collegial help and peer counseling, if you will? What type of recommendation would you have?
Well, I don't know enough about I don't know enough about your structure to say something really smart about that right now, because every trauma awareness and peer support program in journalism has to be crafted to the structure and culture of the particular organization, or it's going to fail, right? I would say, though, that if you've got shop stewards or other activist members building up a sort of group of those who are trained a little bit in trauma awareness and a little skilled in having the kind of conversations with colleagues, in being educated ears, in helping folks in locals understand where resources can be found, do that sort of work of peer support, which is not quite the same as peer counseling, the peer support, that we'd be interested in partnering on something like that. I mean, that would be fun, right? And I think would be the way to go. But it would need a kind of an assessment of the role people want to play and what the needs really are.
As far as the cumulative effect of all of this, has there been a study done on, how this ultimately affects someone, how a news career ultimately affects someone?
Yeah. So, we know that there are many risk factors for PTSD, things that increase the likelihood that a tough assignment or serious assignments will eventually get to you and lead to serious psychological injury. One of those risk factors, excuse me, is simply the length of a career, simply the amount of trauma exposure over time. We all have our own baseline capacity for a bunch of different biographical, genetic, and other reasons. And we all have a kind of a different place that eventually can be overtopped. That increases as time goes on if you're covering trauma after trauma after trauma. And that's why sometimes even extremely skilled and resilient crime reporters or war reporters or whatever have covered very difficult stuff can suddenly go through a bad patch, right? A career of trauma exposure does bring added risk. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do that work if you're good at it. It means you may need to up the self-care and be aware of the risk and maybe get help sooner rather than later if you do find yourself changing in ways that you don't like. And that's one of those kind of roles that peer supporters can play, is helping educate people about the things to look for in yourself, or how to have a conversation with a colleague that you see is changing in not so great ways. Okay. So look, we know that a career-long exposure to trauma can have a negative effect. It also brings you skill and insight. We do grow in our ability to tell stories of difficult events. I have way more reporting skills for mayhem now than I had when I was 18 years old, right? I mean, we just like emergency room clinicians, we get better at what we do. And that's a serious gain. So I'm not saying that we're all doomed to being PTSD casualties, but rather we need to be aware both of our strengths and our vulnerabilities.
I see. Let's bring in Mary Cavallaro from SAG-AFTRA here. Mary?
Thanks, Frank. I was just wondering, just as I'm not a journalist, but as somebody who's been with the union for 20 years representing journalists, one of the things that we do as union reps is sometimes, and one of the most rewarding parts of our job is literally taking that phone call at 9, 10, 11 o'clock at night and sitting on the phone with somebody who's been through something, just talking to them for an hour or two. I will tell you that to a person, that's what everybody who I work with say. It's the most rewarding part of our job, is to just have that conversation. And one of the things we hear about is that when you're in a newsroom, sometimes you don't want to share your fears, your concerns about your own well-being with your colleagues, because it can be kind of competitive. And they're afraid to show that weakness to the people that they work with. So I was wondering if you see that a lot.
Oh, sure. This is a competitive profession, and it's an economically uncertain profession these days. And young journalists in particular often are very worried about not getting the next assignment. I think there's a couple of kind of responses to that. One is, well, okay, if you're not going to talk to your immediate colleagues, think about who your other mentors or colleagues outside of this newsroom are, or buddies from journalism school. But you need a cohort. And if you don't have the kind of trust in your own newsroom that enables you to have that conversation, think about who else you can have it with. Okay. And I'm not always saying, by the way, to share feelings. There's such a thing as oversharing, and I'm not a fan of it, right? Sometimes you do need to unburden yourself. Sometimes it's a simple matter of just going through that last kind of hairy assignment and saying, I kind of want to talk this one through to make sure I understand what happened. Sometimes that will be enough to kind of do the mental health work, gain a sense of control over it. I would also say, though, that we do need to push back against stigma. And there's two levels on which this happens. One is managers, bosses, owners do need to be communicating messages that no one will be denied an assignment because they get help. No one will be denied an assignment because of a diagnosis. No one will be, this is basic. The military culture changed dramatically because of top level messages from the brass saying, no one can be denied a promotion because of a PTSD diagnosis, right? You can only be denied a promotion if you can't do your job, which is a totally different thing. And that might argue for getting help sooner rather than later, right? So we need to destigmatize. We need to, as a union, I think the union play a role in destigmatizing. But one of the arguments for a formal peer support system, whether it's rooted in a union or rooted within the structure of a broadcaster, is that if other colleagues know that Mary is the designated peer supporter in the national news desk, there's some confidentiality attached to that with limits. The newsrooms that do it, the roster of peer supporters is like posted on the wall. Everyone knows who they are. And it takes some of that stigma out of it because everybody knows, oh, I can go talk to Mary, and that's a different thing than trying to figure out who you can trust, right? And Mary and a well-trained peer supporter understands confidentiality, understands what the nature of these conversations is, knows about the boundaries of where they shouldn't go or when you need to refer people out for help, right? So, and it also actually takes some of the pressure off of managers too. Sometimes you get managers who feel like they are the sole supports for their units, and that can make for a very bad relationship sometimes. Having respected mentors in the newsroom take on the role of peer supporters has a lot of benefits, and we don't see just this only in news. We see it in firefighters. We see it in a lot of other frontline professions. It's a beneficial approach for that reason. Does that make sense, Mary?
Absolutely. And before I forget, I'm going to hit pause on.
Include with that. Let me ask you, Bruce, tell us about the resources that are available, and maybe someone who doesn't want to speak up now would like to contact you or get some help. What's the best way to do that?
Okay, so first of all, yes, my email, bruce.shapiro@dartcenter.org. Please do be in touch. I would welcome it. Also at Dart Center is our Twitter handle. We're doing an ongoing series of webinars, conversations with journalists, addressing many different aspects of the crises we find ourselves among right now. We've got one coming up, I think, next week on covering wildfires, where we've got both American and Australian journalists who had a lot of experience talking about that particular one. The Dart Center website itself has a massive library of tip sheets, backgrounders, journalist-to-journalist advice, scientific background, all kinds of stuff, both on impact of trauma and on reporting craft. We have an annual program, if you're especially interested in this stuff, called the Ochberg Fellowship, which is a week-long seminar for 15 journalists a year, a deep dive into all of the different questions raised by trauma reporting. We didn't do it this year because we couldn't figure out how to make it work by Zoom. Hopefully next year we'll be able to do it in person, or if not, reconfigure it once we've learned a little more about how Zoom is going to work. And we also do a lot of topic-specific webinars and seminars and other programs. I could go on, but by all means be in touch. By all means reach out to us for our resources.
Bruce, on behalf of all of us at SAG-AFTRA, thank you very much for your time in this important discussion here today. Bruce Shapiro, the Executive Director of the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma, and Mary Cavallaro, thank you very much for organizing this SAG-AFTRA News and Broadcast Department. Funding from the SAG-AFTRA Foundation, we gratefully acknowledge that, in partnership with the Columbia University School of Journalism's DART program. Thank you very much. And Mary, let me turn it back over to you, please.
Thanks, Frank, and thank you, Bruce. I just want to remind everybody, if you haven't received the reminder already, that on Saturday morning, 11 a.m. Eastern, we're going to be doing another DART Center sponsored program with Judith Matloff on covering protests and civil unrest.
And let me just say, if she is thrilling and is so pragmatic about all different kinds of safety strategies for covering protests. She's the person you want with you when things get a little bit out of control. So she's way more funny than I am too, I will say.
Thank you, Bruce. It's at 11 a.m. Eastern and 8 a.m. Pacific. If you need details, and you can reach out to me or your local union rep. And I again can't thank you enough, Bruce. This was wonderful. So thank you very much.
Likewise, and I hope to be continued.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.